There's a moment every cyclist eventually has, standing in a bike shop parking lot, staring down at their tires, wondering if the 45 millimeters of rubber between them and the road is somehow betraying them. Maybe a stranger on a group ride just breezed past on tires that looked like they belong on a gravel truck, and somehow they were faster. Maybe it was the opposite. A rider on skinny 23 millimeter tubulars dropped the whole group on a climb and made everyone else's supposedly optimized 32 millimeter setup look like a mistake. Either way, the question creeps in: wide or narrow? And almost nobody wants to admit that the honest answer depends on math. Most riders have never actually run for themselves. For the better part of 2 decades, the cycling industry has been locked in a slow-motion reversal on tire width, and it has been sold to consumers less as a nuanced trade-off and more as a revelation, a secret the pros supposedly knew all along. Go back to the early 2000s, and the conventional wisdom was almost a religion. Narrower is faster. Full stop. Pro Peloton riders raced on 21 to 23 millimeter tubulars, pumped to 12 bar, and amateurs followed along because that's what looked fast on television. The logic seemed airtight. Less rubber touching the road means less contact patch. Less contact patch means less rolling resistance. Less rolling resistance means less energy wasted, and less wasted energy means more speed. It's clean, it's intuitive, and it is, as it turns out, only partially true. The shift began quietly in the mid-2000s when independent testers, most notably the rolling resistance labs that strap tires to steel drums and measure wattage loss with genuine scientific rigor, started publishing numbers that didn't match the narrative. A wider tire, run at a slightly lower pressure, was in many controlled tests rolling just as fast as a narrower one at higher pressure, and in some cases faster. The explanation, once it caught on, seemed obvious in hindsight. A narrow tire at high pressure doesn't just resist rolling less because of contact patch size, it also transmits far more vibration and impact energy into the frame, into the rider's body, and ultimately into wasted motion that a power meter simply doesn't register as rolling resistance, but absolutely registers as fatigue. A wider tire at lower pressure can deform around road imperfections instead of bouncing over them, converting what would have been lost energy into a smoother, more continuous contact with the surface. On rough pavement or broken tarmac, this effect is not subtle. It can be worth several watts at a given speed, which over a long ride is the difference between finishing fresh and finishing cooked. This is where the story usually stops, at the tidy revelation that wide is actually faster, and where most content about tire width politely wraps up with a recommendation to run something in the 32 to 38 millimeter range and never think about it again. But that's not the whole truth, and it's the part almost nobody in the industry wants to say out loud, because it complicates a very profitable marketing narrative. Wider tires are not universally faster, they are conditionally faster. And the condition that matters most is road surface, not rider preference. On genuinely smooth, freshly paved asphalt, the kind you find on a closed criterium circuit or a well-maintained European time trial course, the rolling resistance advantage of a wider tire shrinks dramatically, and at high speed, a second cost starts to dominate the equation that the drum tests never fully capture: aerodynamic drag. A wider tire, especially when it bulges out past the rim's edge, disrupts airflow around the wheel and fork in a way a narrower rim-matched tire does not. Above roughly 25 to 30 kilometers per hour, aerodynamic drag becomes the single largest resistive force a cyclist faces, dwarfing rolling resistance by a wide margin. This is precisely why time trial specialists and track sprinters, the riders most obsessed with squeezing out every possible watt, have not universally swung to 40 millimeter tires, the way gravel and endurance riders have. Many still run tires in the 25 to 28 millimeter range specifically because, on smooth surfaces, at race speed, the aero penalty of extra width outweighs the comfort and rolling resistance gains. The industry sells wide is fast, as if it were a single, universal truth, when the actual truth is that the fastest tire width is a function of surface roughness and speed. and those two variables pull in opposite directions. There's a mid-script story worth knowing here, because it explains a lot about why this got so confused in the first place. Tire and rim standards used to be built around a much narrower baseline. Rims were commonly 15 millimeters internal width, and a 23 millimeter tire mounted on that rim actually measured close to its labeled width. As internal rim widths crept up to 19, 21, and now 25 millimeters or more, the same labeled tire size started measuring wider in the real world purely from being stretched over a broader rim bed. A 25 millimeter tire on a modern wide rim might actually measure 28 millimeters once mounted and inflated. This created a strange side effect where riders who thought they were sticking with narrow tires were, without realizing it, already riding wider tires than the label suggested, which is part of why the AHA wide tires are secretly faster discovery landed so hard. Riders were comparing old narrow rim, narrow tire setups against new wide rim, wide tire setups, and attributing the entire performance gain to tire width alone, when rim width, tire rim compatibility, and pressure were all changing at the same time. If you're still with this, here's where it's worth pausing to say something plainly, because it's the sort of practical detail that actually changes how a ride feels, rather than just how it looks on a spec sheet. Tire pressure matters more than tire width in isolation, and running a wide tire at the same pressure you used to run on a narrow tire is close to the worst possible outcome, giving you the aero penalty of width without the comfort or rolling benefit, because the tire is now overinflated for its volume. The entire point of a wider tire is that it can and should run meaningfully lower pressure than a narrow one for the same rider weight and surface, letting the increased air volume do the work of absorbing impacts instead of the tire carcass bouncing rigidly off every crack and pothole. Riders who tried wide tires and didn't feel a difference have, in a huge number of cases, simply never adjusted their pressure to match. And this single fact is the most common reason people end up unconvinced by a genuinely sound piece of engineering. This is a good moment to mention that the Cycles Corner exists precisely for conversations like this one, where the internet's easy answer and the actual physics diverge. And if that's useful, sticking around and subscribing means catching the next deep dive before it's buried under 100 other videos telling you the simple version. Now, for the part that gets uncomfortable, because it's not really about physics anymore, it's about how consumer cycling media and bike brands turned a legitimate engineering finding into a sales cycle. Once rolling resistance testing established that wider tires could be faster on rough roads, an entire product category exploded almost overnight. Gravel bikes, all road bikes, wide rim wheel sets, and tire lines in the 32 to 50 millimeter range flooded the market within a few short years, and much of the marketing quietly dropped the conditional part of the finding. Wider tires are faster became the headline, stripped of on rough surfaces at lower pressure up to a point, and only once aerodynamic losses are accounted for at your actual riding speed. That's not dishonest exactly, but it is a convenient simplification, because a simplification that says, buy this new wider wheel set and tire set for a genuine performance gain, sells a lot more product than a nuanced explanation that says, it depends on where you ride and how fast you go. There's also a genuinely uncomfortable structural reality underneath all of this that almost nobody selling tires wants to bring up. The rolling resistance testing that started this entire revolution was largely conducted on smooth steel drums in laboratory conditions, which is a reasonable proxy for a smooth asphalt, but a poor proxy for the broken, cracked, patched, and gravel-strewn roads most recreational riders actually spend their time on. Real-world testing on actual road surfaces has shown gains for wider tires that are sometimes larger than lab tests suggest, because a drum simply cannot replicate a pothole edge or a seam in the pavement the way real tarmac can. This means, somewhat ironically, that for the average commuter or weekend rider grinding over cracked city streets and patchy back roads, the case for wider tires is probably understated by most of the marketing copy, not overstated, at least up until the point where the tire gets wide enough to meaningfully hurt aerodynamics at the speeds that rider actually holds. So, where does that leave an honest answer? Because at this point, it would be easy to throw up your hands and say, it's complicated and move on. It's more useful than that. If most of your riding happens on rough, cracked, or unpredictable pavement, and your average speed sits below roughly 28 kilometers per hour, a wider tire in the 32 to 40 millimeter range, run at a properly lowered pressure for your weight, is very likely to be both faster and dramatically more comfortable, and the aerodynamic cost at those speeds is close to irrelevant. If you're racing on closed, smooth courses at higher sustained speeds, particularly in a time trial or criterium setting, the calculus shifts, and something in the 25 to 28 millimeter range, matched properly to your rim's internal width so the tire doesn't balloon out past the rim edge, is likely to be the genuinely faster choice once aerodynamic drag is accounted for. Neither answer is universally right, and any content that tells you there's one correct tire width for every rider on every road is selling you something, whether that's a product or just a tidy story. There's another layer to this that rarely makes it into the wide versus narrow debate at all, and it has nothing to do with rolling resistance or aerodynamics directly. Tubeless technology changed the entire equation for both camps at roughly the same time. The width debate was heating up, and conflating the two is one of the most common mistakes riders make when they try to explain their own experience. A rider who switches from a narrow clincher tire with an inner tube to a wider tubeless setup is changing two variables at once. Tire width and puncture protection system and tubeless setups running sealant can typically handle meaningfully lower pressures without the pinch flat risk that plagues tube tires at low pressure. That means a lot of the wider tires transformed my ride testimonials floating around forums and comment sections are really wider tubeless tires at appropriately low pressure transformed my ride testimonials. And the tubeless part of that sentence is doing more work than most riders realize. Try running a wide tire with an inner tube at the same low pressure you'd use tubeless, and you're now flirting with pinch flats on every sharp-edged pothole, which is exactly the kind of frustrating experience that sends someone back to narrower tires and a headline in their mind that says, "Wide tires don't work for me," when the actual issue was tube choice, not tire width. Weight is the other variable that almost never gets its fair mention, mostly because it's the least flattering fact for the wide tire argument. A wider tire, and the wider rim it typically pairs with, simply weighs more than a narrow tire and rim combination, sometimes by a meaningful margin once you account for both wheels, the tubes or sealant, and the slightly heavier tire casing needed to support a larger air volume safely. Rotating weight at the wheel has an outsized effect on acceleration and climbing compared to the same weight carried elsewhere on the bike, because it has to be spun up as well as lifted. For a rider doing repeated hard accelerations, criterium racing, or steep technical climbing where snappy response matters more than sustained rolling efficiency, that extra rotational mass is a real cost that the rolling resistance drum tests, which measure steady-state rolling at constant speed, simply don't capture. This is part of why you'll still find plenty of climbers and criterium specialists on tires narrower than the current gravel-driven trend would suggest. And it's not because they missed the memo on rolling resistance science, it's because their specific demands weight acceleration and low rotational mass more heavily than steady-state comfort. It's worth being honest about sample size and context too, because a lot of the wide tire enthusiasm online comes from a fairly specific subset of riders. Gravel racers and bike packers covering long distances on genuinely rough, unpaved, or mixed terrain, where the case for width is closest to unambiguous. Their experience is real, and their advice is generally sound for their own riding, but it gets generalized into blanket statements aimed at road cyclists, commuters, and racers whose surfaces and speeds look nothing like a gravel course in the high desert. A recommendation that's excellent for someone spending 6 hours a day on washboard gravel roads is not automatically the right recommendation for someone doing a Tuesday night crit on freshly repaved tarmac, and treating tire width advice as one size fits all is exactly the kind of oversimplification that got the whole conversation muddled in the first place. The tire width conversation also quietly exposes something bigger about how cycling advice spreads in general, which is worth sitting with for a second. An engineering finding gets discovered in a lab, gets simplified into a headline, gets amplified by brands with product to sell, and gets absorbed by riders as an unconditional truth, when the actual research underneath it was always full of caveats about surface, speed, and pressure that got quietly dropped somewhere between the white paper and the marketing copy. Wide tires aren't a scam, and narrow tires aren't outdated relics either. They're two tools that solve different problems. And the industry's incentive has never really been to help you pick the right one. It's been to sell you the new one. If any of that changed how you think about the tires currently sitting on your bike, the next video is going to dig into something just as misunderstood, a mechanical component nearly every rider adjusts wrong without ever realizing it. And subscribing now means it lands in front of you the moment it's out, instead of getting lost in the feed. The honest, unglamorous truth nobody really wants to put on a box or a banner ad is this: the right tire width is a calculation involving your road surface, your average speed, your rim's internal width, and your tire pressure. And skipping any one of those variables while chasing a single, faster number is how riders end up disappointed by a genuinely good piece of engineering. Run the wide tire, but drop the pressure to match. Run the narrow tire, but only if your roads and your speed actually justify it. The bike industry would rather you just buy what's trending. Your legs, your lower back, and your actual finishing times will thank you for doing the math instead. If there's a practical starting point worth taking away from all of this, it's simpler than the science behind it. Check your rim's internal width before buying any new tire, because mismatched rim and tire widths are responsible for a huge share of disappointing experiences on both sides of this debate. Use a pressure calculator based on your weight, tire width, and typical terrain, rather than defaulting to whatever number is printed on the tire's sidewall, since that printed range is usually a wide safety window, rather than a genuine recommendation. And be honest with yourself about what kind of roads you actually ride most often, because the tire that's right for your one dream gravel adventure each year is not necessarily the tire that should live on your bike for the other 50 weekends of commuting and club rides on cracked city pavement. Cycling is full of gear decisions dressed up as performance science when they're really about matching the tool to the job in front of you. And tire width might be the clearest example of that pattern in the entire sport.